Hello, this is John T. Rhapsodes Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories, bringing you a funny one today from 1907 called The Handbook of Hymen by O. Henry. An important note before we proceed. When the characters reference a man named Homer K.M., and later a woman named Ruby Ott, they are clumsily referring to the book of Persian poetry from the 1100s called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which was translated into English by Edward Fitzgerald in 1859. The book became widely popular in the U.S. in the 1880s. One of the more popular quatrains was, "A book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness." One question arising from this story is, what one book would you want to be stuck with if you were snowed in? Hear the words of old. The Handbook of Hymen from 1907 by O. Henry. "'Tis the opinion of myself, Sanderson Pratt, who sets this down, that the educational system of the United States should be in the hands of the Weather Bureau. I can give you good reasons for it, and you can't tell me why our college professors shouldn't be transferred to the meteorological department. They've been learned to read, and they could very easily glance at the morning papers and then wire in to the main office what kind of weather to expect. But there's the other side of the proposition. I'm going on to tell you how the weather furnished me and Idaho Green with an elegant education. We was up in the Bitterroot Mountains over the Montana line, prospecting for gold. A chin-whiskered man in Walla Walla, carrying a line of hope as excess baggage, had grub-staked us. And there we was in the foothills pecking away with enough grub on hand to last an army through a peace conference. Along one day comes a mail rider over the mountains from Carlos, and stops to eat 3 cans of greengages and leave us a newspaper of modern date. This paper prints a system of premonitions of the weather, and the card it dealt Bitterroot Mountains from the bottom of the deck was warmer and fair with light westerly breezes. But that evening it began to snow, with the wind strong in the east. Me and Idaho moved camp into an old empty cabin higher up the mountain, thinking it was only a November flurry. But after falling 3 foot on a level, it went to work in earnest, and we knew we was snowed in. We got in plenty of firewood before it got deep, and we had grub enough for 2 months, so we let the elements rage and cut up all they thought proper. If you want to instigate the art of manslaughter, just shut 2 men up in an 18 by 20 foot cabin for a month. Human nature won't stand it. When the first snowflakes fell, me and Idaho Green laughed at each other's jokes and praised the stuff we turned out of a skillet and called bread. At the end of 3 weeks, Idaho makes this kind of edict to me. He says, "I never exactly heard sour milk dropping out of a balloon on the bottom of a tin pan. But I have an idea it would be music of the spears compared to this attenuated stream of asphyxiated thought that emanates out of your organs of conversation. The kind of half-masticated noises that you emit every day puts me in mind of a cow's cud, only she's lady enough to keep hers to herself, and you ain't." "Mr. Green," says I, "you having been a friend of mine once, I have some hesitations in confessing to you that if I had my choice for society between you and a common yellow 3-legged cur pup, one of the inmates of this here cabin would be wagging a tail just at present. This way we goes on for 2 or 3 days, and then we quit speaking to one another. We divides up the cooking implements, and Idaho cooks his grub on one side of the fireplace, and me on the other. The snow is up to the windows, and we have to keep a fire all day. You see, me and Idaho never had any education beyond reading and doing "If John had 3 apples and James 5" on a slate. We never felt any special need for a university degree, though we had acquired a species of intrinsic intelligence in knocking around the world that we could use in emergencies. But, snowbound in that cabin in the Bitterroots, we felt for the first time that if we had studied Homer or Greek and fractions and the higher branches of information, we'd have had some resources in the line of meditation and private thought. I've seen them Eastern college fellas working in camps all through the West, and I never noticed but what education was less of a drawback to them than you would think. Why, once over on Snake River, when Andrew McWilliams' saddle horse got the bots, he sent a buckboard 10 miles for one of these strangers that claimed to be a botanist. But that horse died. One morning, Idaho was poking around with a stick on top of a little shelf that was too high to reach. 2 books fell down to the floor. I started toward him, but caught Idaho's eye. He speaks for the first time in a week. "Don't burn your fingers," says he. "In spite of the fact that you're only fit to be the companion of a sleeping mud turtle, I'll give you a square deal. And that's more than your parents did when they turned you loose in the world with the social ability of a rattlesnake and the bedside manner of a frozen turnip. I'll play you a game of 7-Up, the winner to pick up his choice of the book, the loser to take the other." We played, and Idaho won. He picked up his book, and I took mine. Then each of us got on his side of the house and went to reading. I never was as glad to see a 10-ounce nugget as I was that book. And Idaho took at his like a kid looks at a stick of candy. Mine was a little book about 5 by 6 inches called Herkimer's Handbook of Indispensable Information. I may be wrong, but I think that was the greatest book that ever was written. I've got it today, and I can stump you or any man 50 times in 5 minutes with the information in it. Talk about Solomon or the New York Tribune. Herkimer had cases on both of them. That man must have put in 50 years and traveled 1,000,000 miles to find out all that stuff. There was the population of all cities in it, and the way to tell a girl's age, and the number of teeth a camel has. It told you the longest tunnel in the world, the number of the stars, how long it takes for chicken pox to break out, what a lady's neck ought to measure, the veto powers of governors, the dates of the Roman aqueducts, how many pounds of rice going without 3 beers a day would buy, the average annual temperature of Augusta, Maine, the quantity of seed required to plant an acre of carrots and drills, antidotes for poisons, the number of hairs on a blonde lady's head, how to preserve eggs, the height of all the mountains in the world, and the dates of all wars and battles, and how to restore drowned persons, and sunstroke, and the number of tacks in a pound, and how to make dynamite and flowers and beds, and what to do before the doctor comes, and 100 times as many things besides. If there was anything Herkimer didn't know, I didn't miss it out of the book. I sat and read that book for 4 hours. All the wonders of education was compressed in it. I forgot the snow, and I forgot that me and old Idaho was on the outs. He was sitting still on a stool, reading away with a kind of partly soft and partly mysterious look shining through his tan bark whiskers. "Idaho," says I, "what kind of book is yours?" Idaho must have forgot, too, for he answered moderate, without any slander or malignity. "Why," says he, "this here seems to be a volume by Homer K.M." "Homer K.M. what?" I asks. "Why, just Homer K.M., says Idaho. "You're a liar," says I, a little riled that Idaho should try to put me up a tree. "No man is going to go round signing books with his initials. If it's Homer K.M. Spoopendike, or Homer K.M. McSweeney, or Homer K.M. Jones, why don't you say so like a man instead of biting off the end of it like a calf chewing off the tail of a shirt on a clothesline?" "I put it to you straight, Sandy," says Idaho, quiet. "It's a poem book," says he, "by Homer K.M. I couldn't get color out of it at first, but there's a vein if you follow it up. I wouldn't have missed this book for a pair of red blankets." "Well, you're welcome to it," says I. "What I want is a disinterested statement of facts for the mind to work on, and that's what I seem to find in the book I've drawn." "What you've got," says Idaho, "is statistics, the lowest grade of information that exists. They'll poison your mind. Give me old K.M.'s system of surmises. He seems to be a kind of a wine agent. His regular toast is nothing doing, and he seems to have a grouch. But he keeps it so well lubricated with booze that his worst kicks sound like an invitation to split a quart. But it's poetry," says Idaho, "and I have sensations of scorn for that truck of yours that tries to convey sense in feet and inches. When it comes to explaining the instinct of philosophy through the art of nature, old K.M. has got your man beat by drills, rows, paragraphs, chest measurement, and average annual rainfall." So that's the way me and Idaho had it. Day and night, all the excitement we got was studying our books. That snowstorm sure fixed us with a fine lot of attainments apiece. By the time the snow melted, if you had stepped up to me suddenly and said, "Sanderson Pratt, what would it cost per square foot to lay a roof with 20 by 28 tin at $9.50 per box?" I'd have told you, as quick as light could travel the length of a spade handle, at the rate of 192,000 miles per second. How many can do it? You wake up most any man you know in the middle of the night and ask him quick to tell you the number of bones in the human skeleton, exclusive of the teeth, or what percentage of the vote of the Nebraska legislature overrules a veto. Will he tell you? Try him and see. About what benefit Idaho got out of his poetry book, I didn't exactly know. Idaho boosted the wine agent every time he opened his mouth, but I wasn't so sure. This Homer K.M., from what leaked out of his libretto through Idaho, seemed to me to be a kind of a dog who looked at life like it was a tin can tied to his tail. After running himself half to death, he sits down, hangs his tongue out, and looks at the can and says, "Oh well, since we can't shake the growler, let's get it filled at the corner, and I'll have a drink on me." That spring, me and Idaho struck Purveyor. It was a habit of ours to sell out quick and keep moving. We unloaded our grub staker for $8,000 apiece. and then we drifted down to this little town of Rosa on the Salmon River to rest up and get some human grub and have our whiskers harvested. Rosa was no mining camp. It laid in the valley and was as free of uproar and pestilence as one of them rural towns in the country. There was a 3-mile trolley line champing its bit in the environs, and me and Idaho spent a week riding on one of the cars, dropping off at nights to the Sunset View Hotel. Being now well-read, as well as well-traveled, we was soon pro re nata with the best society in Rosa, and was invited out to the most dressed-up and high-toned entertainments. It was at a piano recital and quail-eating contest in the city hall for the benefit of the fire company that me and Idaho first met Mrs. D. Ormond Sampson, the queen of Rosa society. Mrs. Sampson was a widow and owned the only 2-story house in town. It was painted yellow, and whichever way you looked from, you could see it as plain as egg on the chin of an O'Grady on Friday. 22 men in Rosa besides me and Idaho was trying to stake a claim on that yellow house. There was a dance after the songbooks and quail bones had been raked out of the hall. 23 of the bunch galloped over to Mrs. Sampson and asked for a dance. I sidestepped the 2-step and asked permission to escort her home. That's where I made a hit. On the way home, says she, "Ain't the stars lovely and bright tonight, Mr. Pratt?" "For the chance they've got," says I, "they're humping themselves in a mighty credible way. That big one you see is 66 million miles distant. It took 36 years for its light to reach us. With an 18-foot telescope, you could see 43 millions of them, including them of the 13th magnitude, which, if one was to go out now, you would keep on seeing it for 2,700 years. "My," says Mrs. Sampson, "I never knew that before. How warm it is. I'm as damp as I can be from dancing so much." "Well, that's easy to account for," says I, "when you happen to know that you've got 2 million sweat glands working all at once. If every one of your perspiratory ducts, which are a quarter of an inch long, was placed end to end, they would reach a distance of 7 miles. "Lawsy," says Mrs. Sampson, "it sounds like an irrigation ditch you were describing, Mr. Pratt. How do you get all this knowledge of information?" "From observation, Mrs. Sampson," I tells her. "I keep my eyes open when I go about the world." "Mr. Pratt," says she, "I always did admire a man of education. There are so few scholars among the sap-headed plug-uglies of this town that it is a real pleasure to converse with a gentleman of culture. I'd be gratified to have you call at my house whenever you feel so inclined." And that was the way I got the goodwill of the lady in the yellow house. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, I used to go there and tell her about the wonders of the universe as discovered, tabulated, and compiled from nature by Herkimer. Idaho and the other happy Lutherans of the town got every minute of the rest of the week that they could. I never imagined that Idaho was trying to work on Mrs. Sampson with old KM's rules of courtship till one afternoon when I was on my way over to take her a basket of wild hog plums. I met the lady coming down the lane that led to her house. Her eyes was snapping, and her hat made a dangerous dip over one eye. "Mr. Pratt," she opens up, "this Mr. Green is a friend of yours, I believe." "For 9 years," says I. "Well, cut him out," says she. "He's no gentleman." Why, ma'am, says I, he's a plain incumbent of the mountains, with asperities and the usual failings of a spendthrift and a liar, but I never on the most momentous occasion had the heart to deny that he was a gentleman. It may be that in haberdashery and the sense of arrogance and display, Idaho offends the eye, but inside, ma'am, I found him impervious to the lower grades of crime and obesity. After 9 years of Idaho's society, Mrs. Sampson, I winds up, I should hate to impute him, and I should hate to see him imputed. It's right plausible of you, Mr. Pratt, says Mrs. Sampson, to take up the curmudgeons in your friend's behalf, but it don't alter the fact that he has made proposals to me sufficiently obnoxious to ruffle the ignominy of any lady. Why, now, says I, old Idaho do that? I could believe it of myself sooner. I never knew but one thing to deride in him, and a blizzard was responsible for that. Once, while he was snowbound in the mountains, he became a prey to a kind of spurious and uneven poetry, which may have corrupted his demeanor. It has, says Mrs. Sampson. Ever since I knew him, he's been reciting to me a lot of irreligious rhymes by some person he calls Ruby Ott, and who is no better than she should be if you judge by her poetry. Then Idaho has struck a new book, says I, for the one he had was by a man who writes under the nom de plume of K.M. Well, he'd better have stuck to it, said Mrs. Sampson, whatever it was. And today he caps the vortex. I get a bunch of flowers from him, and on 'em is pinned a note. Now, Mr. Pratt, you know a lady when you see her, and you know how I stand in Rosa's society. Do you think for a moment that I'd skip out to the woods with a man along with a jug of wine and a loaf of bread and go singing and cavorting up and down under the trees with him? I take a little claret with my meals, but I'm not in the habit of packing a jug of it into the brush and raising Cain in any such style as that. And of course, he'd bring his book of verses along too. He said so. Let him go on his scandalous picnics alone, or let him take his Ruby Ott with him. I reckon she wouldn't kick unless it was on account of there being too much bread along. And what do you think of your gentleman friend now, Mr. Pratt? Well, says I, it may be that Idaho's invitation was a kind of poetry and meant no harm. Maybe it belonged to the class of rhymes they call figurative. They offend law and order, but they get sent through the mails on the grounds that they mean something that they don't say. I'd be glad on Idaho's account if you'd overlook it, says I, and let us extricate our minds from the low regions of poetry to the higher planes of fact and fancy. On a beautiful afternoon like this, Mrs. Sampson, I goes on, we should let our thoughts dwell accordingly. Though it is warm here, we should remember that at the equator the line of perpetual frost is at an altitude of 15,000 feet. Between the latitudes of 40 degrees and 49 degrees, it is from 4,000 to 9,000 feet. Oh, Mr. Pratt, says Mrs. Sampson, it's such a comfort to hear you say them beautiful facts after getting such a jar from that minx of a Ruby's poetry. Let us sit on this log at the roadside, says I, and forget the inhumanity and ribaldry of the poets. It is in the glorious columns of ascertained facts and legalized measures that beauty is to be found. In this very log we sit upon, Mrs. Sampson, says I, is statistics more wonderful than any poem. The rings show it was 60 years old. At the depth of 2,000 feet, it would become coal in 3,000 years. The deepest coal mine in the world is at Killingsworth near Newcastle. A box 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2 feet 8 inches deep will hold 1 ton of coal. If an artery is cut, compress it above the wound. A man's leg contains 30 bones. The Tower of London was burned in 1841. "Go on, Mr. Pratt," says Mrs. Sampson. "Them ideas is so original and soothing. I think statistics are just as lovely as they can be." But it wasn't till 2 weeks later that I got all that was coming to me out of Herkimer. One night I was waked up by folks hollering "Fire!" all around. I jumped up and dressed and went out of the hotel to enjoy the scene. When I see it was Mrs. Sampson's house, I gave forth a kind of yell, and I was there in 2 minutes. The whole lower story of the yellow house was in flames, and every masculine, feminine, and canine in Rosa was there, screeching and barking and getting in the way of the firemen. I saw Idaho trying to get away from 6 firemen who were holding him. They was telling him the whole place was on fire downstairs and no man could go in and come out alive. "Where's Mrs. Sampson?" I asked. "She hasn't been seen," says one of the firemen. "She sleeps upstairs. We've tried to get in, but we can't, and our company hasn't got any ladders yet." I runs around to the light of the big blaze and pulls the handbook out of my inside pocket. I kind of laughed when I felt it in my hands. I reckon I was some daffy with the sensation of excitement. "Herky, old boy," I says to the book as I flipped over the pages, "you ain't ever lied to me yet, and you ain't ever thrown me down at a scratch yet. Tell me what, old boy, tell me what," says I. I turned to what to do in case of accidents on page 117. I run my finger down the page and struck it. Good old Herkimer, he never overlooked anything. It said, "Suffocation from inhaling smoke or gas. There is nothing better than flaxseed. Place a few seed in the outer corner of the eye." I shoved the handbook back in my pocket and grabbed a boy that was running by. "Here," says I, giving him some money. "Run to the drugstore and bring me $1 worth of flaxseed. Hurry, and you'll get another one for yourself. Now," I sings out to the crowd, "we'll have Mrs. Sampson," and I throws away my coat and hat. 4 of the firemen and citizens grabs hold of me. It's sure death, they say, to go in that house, for the floors was beginning to fall through. "How in blazes," I sings out, kind of laughing yet, but not feeling like it, "do you expect me to put flaxseed in an eye without the eye?" I jabbed each elbow in a fireman's face, kicked the bark off one citizen's shin, and tripped the other one with a side hold. And then I busted into the house. If I die first, I'll write you a letter and tell you if it's any worse down there than the inside of that yellow house was. But don't believe it yet. I was a heap more cooked than the hurry-up orders of a broiled chicken that you get in restaurants. The fire and smoke had me down on the floor twice, and was about to shame Herkimer, but the firemen helped me with their little streams of water, and I got to Mrs. Sampson's room. She'd lost consciousness from the smoke, so I wrapped her in the bedclothes and got her on my shoulder. Well, the floors wasn't as bad as they said, or I never could have done it. Not by no means. I carried her out 50 yards from the house and laid her on the grass. Then, of course, every one of them other 22 plaintiffs to the lady's hand crowded around with 10 dippers of water ready to save her. And up runs the boy with the flaxseed. I unwrapped the covers from Mrs. Sampson's head. She opened her eyes and says, "Is that you, Mr. Pratt?" "Shh," says I, Don't talk till you've had the remedy. I runs my arm around her neck and raises her head, gentle, and breaks the bag of flaxseed with the other hand. And as easy as I could, I bends over and slips 3 or 4 of the seeds in the outer corner of her eye. Up gallops the village doc by this time, and snorts around, and grabs at Mrs. Sampson's pulse, and wants to know what I mean by any such sandblasted nonsense. "Well, old jalap in Jerusalem oak seed," says I, "I'm no regular practitioner, but I'll show you my authority anyway." They fetched my coat, and I gets out the handbook. "Look on page 117, says I, "at the remedy for suffocation by smoke or gas. Flaxseed in the outer corner of the eye, it says. I don't know whether it works as a smoke consumer, or whether it hikes the compound gastrohippopotamus nerve into action. But Herkimer says it, and he was called to the case first. If you want to make it a consultation, there's no objection." Old Doc takes the book and looks at it by means of his specs and a fireman's lantern. "Well, Mr. Pratt," says he, "you evidently got on the wrong line in reading your diagnosis. The recipe for suffocation says, get the patient into fresh air as quickly as possible and place in a reclining position. The flaxseed remedy is for dust and cinders in the eye on the line above. But after all—" "See here," interrupts Mrs. Sampson, "I reckon I've got something to say in this consultation. That flaxseed done me more good than anything I ever tried." And then she raises up her head and lays it back on my arm again and says, "Put some in the other eye, Sandy dear." And so, if you was to stop off at Rosa tomorrow, or any other day, you'd see a fine new yellow house with Mrs. Pratt, that was Mrs. Sampson, embellishing and adorning it. And if you was to step inside, you'd see on the marble-top center table, in the parlor, Herkimer's Handbook of Indispensable Information, all rebound in red morocco and ready to be consulted on any subject pertaining to human happiness and wisdom. And that concludes O. Henry's 1907 story called The Handbook of Hymen. As asked in the introduction, what one book would you want to be stuck with in a snowed-in cabin? Tell us about it in the comments section. This is John T. Rhapsodies Esquire, purveyor of awesome old-school audio stories. Thank you for listening. If you like the music you heard in the introduction and throughout this story, stay tuned to hear more at the end of the video. You can find more stories like this in the channel's playlists. Find them by staying tuned for the last 20 seconds of this video and clicking on the end screen icon. You can also go to the channel homepage and click on the word Playlists. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please help me earn the warm embrace of Mr. and Mrs. YouTubes who look with loving favor upon those channels whose listeners faithfully subscribe, like, comment, click the notification bell, and share the videos with their friends so that they too can hear the words of old.